Welcome to Mode Bespoke, I'm Atenas. In today's tutorial, we're going to be working on a scarf pattern. Now this pattern features the Tunisian braided puff stitch. So let's get started. So let's go over the materials we're going to need for this project. You're going to need yarn, a Tunisian crochet hook, a yarn needle, pair of scissors, and some stitch markers. Now the stitch markers are optional. You can still make the scarf if you don't have them. It just helps when you're working on the puff stitch. It helps keep track of where the stitch is at. You can find the written PDF pattern for this project on my website. I'll leave a link in the description box below. So let's talk a little bit more about the yarn I'm going to be using for this project, because you can use a variety of yarns. The one I'm going to be using for this tutorial is called Wool-like. You can find this at Michael's stores here in the US, and this is a size 1 fingering yarn. We are going to be doubling up on the thread, so you will use 2 threads simultaneously, and this will make a scarf that measures approximately 5 inches across, so it'll be 5 inches wide, by 26 inches long. We are going to be using 2 threads at the same time, so you will be crocheting with both of them. And for those of you that are not comfortable using 2 threads at the same time, you can use a thicker yarn and just use a single thread. So you can use a sport yarn or a DK yarn and still use the same size hook. We're going to be using a 5mm Tunisian hook, and this is the Knit Pal Tunisian hook. I made a video about this a few weeks ago, and this is the 16-inch cord. So if you would like to buy a hook like this, it comes in a set. I'll leave the link in the description box below. If you want to make a thick winter version of this scarf, you can also use a medium-sized yarn. So medium or worsted, whatever you want to call it, but you would have to switch your hook. And this is a small sample using a medium or number 4 yarn. As you can see, it is a bit wider, and it's the same stitch count. It is a bit wider than the scarf we're going to be making today. So this one measures about 9 inches across. So yeah, it's a few inches wider, but it does make a nice winter, more heavy duty scarf. You would have to switch your hook to an 8mm hook. So if you are using a fingering, sport, or DK yarn, you use a 5mm hook. If you're using a number 4 medium or worsted yarn, you use an 8mm hook. You can use your favorite yarn to make this pattern. Just make sure that you match the hook to your yarn size. Now, for those of you that don't live in the US and can't find wool-like yarn, you can use any size 1 fingering yarn that you want. For this type of project, I prefer to use a yarn that is really soft. This one is an acrylic and nylon blend. Really, use whatever yarn that, any fingering yarn that you have available to you. So let's get started here. Like I said before, you're going to be using 2 threads simultaneously. So I'm going to use the side pull, so I'll find the thread on this side. And I'm also going to use a center pull so that I use just the 1 ball of yarn. So if it's easier for you, you can buy 2 and then just use the thread, 1 thread from each of them. But I'm going to use a center pull, but this one's a little bit hard to find. So let me get the thread from the inside here, and then we can get started. So once we have our 2 threads, we're ready to get started. Now just a quick repeat, if you do not like using 2 threads simultaneously, you can switch to a sport or a DK yarn and just use 1 thread. I get loads of questions about this, so yes, you totally can use just the 1 thread. Alright, so we're going to begin with a slip knot. So leave a tail end of yarn, and then to make your slip knot, you're just going to wrap your yarn around 2 fingers. So I'm going to grab here, wrap it around 2 fingers, then I'm going to insert my hook into this front loop and grab the yarn that's right behind it, and then I'm going to pull that through. Now you can remove your fingers from the knot and just pull on the 2 threads below your knot to tighten up your slip knot. So make it nice and tight around your hook, and we're ready to begin. We're going to crochet a chain of 26 stitches. Now this stitch does have multiples, so if you want to make this wider or you want to make it more narrow, or you'd even like to use the same stitch to make a blanket or a shawl or something like that, I will talk to you about the different multiples at the end of the video. So for now, we're going to begin with a chain of 26 stitches. So to make a chain, you're going to wrap the yarn around your hook like this, and you're going to pull this top loop through the bottom one. So there is 1. So yarn over, pull through for 2, yarn over, pull through for 3, yarn over, pull through for 4, and just continue until you have a chain of 26 stitches. Once you've completed your chain, should look like this, we're going to begin a foundation row. Now this foundation row is different than our usual foundation rows for our Tunisian work. First, we're going to skip that very first chain. Since you've already got the loop on your hook, we're going to begin in the second chain from your hook. You're going to cast on a stitch. So you're going to insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, and you're going to pull up a loop. So there's 1. We're going to repeat this in 3 more stitches. So we're going to go into the next one, we're going to insert our hook, we're going to yarn over and pull up a loop for 2. Insert your hook, yarn over, pull up a loop for 3, and then insert your hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop for 4. So we have cast on 4 loops, but we have 5 loops on our hook. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Remember that we did double up on the thread, so each loop is going to be made up of 2 threads, so don't count each thread individually if you are using a doubled up yarn. Alright, so now let's work on our puff stitch. Now in the next chain, we're going to make our very first puff stitch. You're going to yarn over, and you're going to insert your hook into that stitch. You're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So you're going to pull up 2 loops. We're going to repeat this 2 more times. Yarn over, insert your hook into the same stitch. Yarn over and pull up a loop. So that's 2. We're going to repeat it 1 last time. So you're going to yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. So you're going to end up with a total of 6 loops. So at the end of your puff stitch, it's 6 loops. You inserted your hook into the stitch only 3 times. So that was 1 puff stitch. In the stitch right next to this one, we're going to repeat. So right in here, we're going to make a second puff stitch. So we're going to begin with a yarn over, insert into the hook, or insert into the stitch, sorry, yarn over and pull up a loop for 1, and then you're going to yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop for 2, and yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop for 3. So here we go, your second puff stitch. So on your puff stitches, the total is 12 loops. Each puff stitch is made up of 6 loops. So for those of you that aren't going to be using the stitch markers, you're going to need that stitch count later. Alright, so in the next 5 stitches, we're going to cast on stitches like we did at the beginning of the row. So we're just going to insert our hook into the stitch, but make sure you go through both threads. There we go. You're going to yarn over, and you're going to pull up a loop. So there's 1. We're going to do the same in the next stitch. So insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. It's 2. Oh, but I need to get 2 threads. There we go. And then we're going to repeat this 3 more times so that we have a total of 5 loops. So go into the next one, yarn over, cast on 1, go into the next one, yarn over, cast on 1, and go into the next one, yarn over, and cast on 1. So now we have 5 just simple cast on stitches. So then it matches the first 5 that we did. We did 2 puff stitch and then 5 cast on. The next 2 stitches are going to be puff stitches. So we're just going to repeat what we did for the puff stitch. So you're going to yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop for 1, yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up 2, and then we're going to do that a 3rd time. Then we're going to repeat in the next stitch. So just make a second puff stitch in the chain right next to that one, so that you have 2 puff stitches right next to each other, and you're going to cast on 1 into each of the next 5 stitches. So I'm just going to cast on 1 here, and then again in the next one, so that we have cast on 5 stitches, and then we're going to make 2 more puff stitches. So as you can see, this is just a very repetitive pattern. So we've got 5, 2 puff, 5, 2 puff, 5, until we get to the end of the row. Alright, so I'm going to finish my last pair of puff stitch. So we go right there, and we're going to be left with 5 chains on our hook. You are going to cast on into each of those chains. So you just cast on one. So I'm going to insert my hook, yarn over and cast on 1, and then in the next stitch 2, and the next one 3, 4, and cast on 1 in the last one for stitch 5. And that is our foundation row. For the return pass, this one's going to be a little bit different. So you're going to yarn over and pull through 1. And then you're going to yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, and then pull through 2, and then you get to the puff stitch. At the puff stitch, you're going to have to yarn over and pull through 7. So yarn over, pull through that 1 loop at the top, plus the 6 that make up the puff stitch. So start again, we're going to yarn over and pull through 7. And then you get to the next puff stitch and you're going to repeat that. So you're going to yarn over and pull through 7. When you get to the cast on stitches, so just the single cast on loop, you're going to yarn over and pull through 2, and then repeat a second time, third time, and then fourth time, and fifth, until you get to the next puff stitch. At the puff stitch, you just yarn over and pull through 7. You get to the next puff stitch, you're going to yarn over, pull through 7. You get to the next section of cast on stitches, so then you just repeat the return pass the way we've been working. Don't forget to yarn over and pull through 7 on the puff stitch, and then once you get to the end of the row and you're left with just 1 loop on your hook, you've completed your foundation row. Let's move on to row number 1. Now for row number 1, we're going to begin by skipping that very first vertical stitch. So this one right here, because you already have that on your hook. So that loop on your hook counts as the first stitch. You're going to work into the second vertical stitch, and if you take a quick look at the vertical stitch, it is made up of 2 loops or 2 legs. So you've got the front one, and let me try to make it so you can see this a little bit better. So here we go. So there's the back loop or the back leg, and there's the front loop or the front leg. You're going to insert your hook behind the top loop or the top leg of the stitch, yarn over, and cast on 1. You're going to repeat this in the next stitch. So this is the Tunisian simple stitch. So you insert your hook behind the top loop, yarn over, and cast on 1. You're going to cast on 4 stitches or 4 loops onto your hook, so that when you finish, you should have a total of 5 loops on your hook. So at this point, if you have your stitch markers, you're going to require 1 stitch marker. So I'm just going to loop this on my hook, and then we're going to begin the puff stitch. So we're going to make both puff stitches in between the 2 puff stitches of the previous row. So we're going to look for the chain space right here that's in between both puff stitches, and that's the stitch we're going to use. So right there. So we're going to cast on our first puff stitch into that chain space. So yarn over, insert your hook into the chain space, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then you repeat that 2 more times so that you have your 6 loops of the first puff stitch. You're going to get your second stitch marker. We're going to place it on our hook, and now we're going to make a second puff stitch. So that second puff stitch, we're going to make it in that same chain space. So we're going to yarn over, insert our hook into the stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. So that's 1, 2, and 3, and now we have our second puff stitch. If you don't have stitch markers, that's okay. You're just going to make your both of your puff stitches in that same stitch anyway. Alright, moving on. We need to cast on the next 5 stitches, and this is going to be a Tunisian simple stitch. The first of the stitches is going to be hidden right after the puff stitch. So it's going to be right there. That's going to be the very first Tunisian simple stitch. It's only hidden on this first row. After that, it's going to be a lot easier to see. But make sure you cast on 5 Tunisian simple stitches in this next section. So here we are at 3, and then 4, and then 5. The last one is also going to be hidden right next to that puff stitch. So make sure you cast on 5, and then just count your loops right after just to make sure, so that way it doesn't affect the width of your scarf. once you've cast on your 5 stitches, you're going to grab another stitch marker, and we're going to place it right after that last Tunisian simple stitch, like so, and we're going to repeat the puff stitch. Now remember that the puff stitch, you're going to make it in the chain space of the 2 or between the 2 puff stitches of the previous row. So you're going to separate your puff stitch, find the chain space in between, and cast on your first puff stitch. You're going to grab a stitch marker, place it on your hook, and then you're going to cast on your second puff stitch in that same chain space. So we go with 3, and there we go. So that was our second puff stitch. And then we have to cast on 5 Tunisian simple stitches. Remember that the stitch is hidden, or the very first stitch is hidden right after that puff stitch, the very last one that we just crocheted. So we've cast on 3, and then 4, and stitch number 5 is hidden right next to that the next puff stitch. You're going to grab a stitch marker and place it right after your last Tunisian simple stitch, and you're going to cast on the last pair of puff stitch. So find the chain space in between the 2 puff stitches of the previous row and cast on your first puff stitch. Grab a stitch marker, place it on your hook, and cast on your last puff stitch. So we got 2 and then 3. Alright, so for the last few stitches of the row, you're only going to cast on 4 Tunisian simple stitches. So you've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. On the final stitch of the row, you're just going to cast on just a regular stitch, and this is the final stitch of the row. You're going to insert your hook behind the top loop or the top leg. You're also going to use the leg or the loop right behind it. So just like that. Go all the way through the work, and then you're going to yarn over and cast on 1. And there's our row. For this return pass, it's going to be very similar to what we did in the previous row. So now we have the stitch markers to kind of help you, to help guide you when you do the return pass. So you're going to work a regular return pass until you get to that first stitch marker. So you're going to yarn over and pull through 1, and then yarn over and pull through 2 until you get to the puff stitch. So yarn over, pull through 2 for 1, yarn over, pull through 2 for 2, and then for 3, and then 4. And then you'll reach your puff stitch. At the puff stitch, you're going to yarn over and pull through 7 loops. But we have a stitch marker, so you don't have to count your loops. You just yarn over and pull through until you reach that first stitch marker. See, and once you reach your stitch marker, you can either pull the stitch marker off, or you can just yarn over and pull through until you get to your next stitch marker. If you have the stitch markers that are like the ones that I have here that look kind of like safety pins, you can just continue working the rest of your return pass and then remove your stitch markers at the end of the row. If you're using a little ring or a little knot of yarn or something, you need to pull your loop off of your hook, remove your stitch marker, and then pull your loop back onto the hook. So once you've removed your stitch marker, you would yarn over and pull through 7 until you reach your next stitch marker. So I'm going to remove my stitch marker. So I'm going to show this to you again. So you're going to pull the loop off of your hook, so this top one. So just pull on your yarn, loosen it up, pull the loop off, pull your stitch marker off, and then place the loop back on your hook and continue to work your return pass. You're going to work a regular return pass for the next 5 stitches. So yarn over, pull through 2 for 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that was just a regular return pass, which is yarn over, pull through 2, until you reach the next puff stitch. At the puff stitch, you're going to yarn over and pull through 7 loops, or if you're using the stitch marker, you just yarn over and pull through until you reach that stitch marker. So make sure you get all of the loops, and once you reach the stitch marker, you just pull the loop off your hook, remove your stitch marker, pull the top loop back on your hook, and then you begin again. So you're going to yarn over and pull through 7 loops until you get to your next stitch marker, remove your stitch marker, and you're going to work a regular return pass in the next 5 stitches. So yarn over, pull through 2 for 1, yarn over, pull through 2 for 2, yarn over, pull through 2 for 3, and then 4, 5, and you'll get to the last pair of puff stitches. At the puff stitch, you're going to yarn over and pull through 7 loops, or yarn over and pull through until you get to your stitch marker. We're going to remove the stitch marker, and then you're going to yarn over and pull through 7 loops, or yarn over and pull through until you get to your stitch marker. Remove your stitch marker, and the rest of the row you complete as a regular return pass. So yarn over, pull through 2 in each of the stitches until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. And that is row 1. Now, row 2 is probably the easiest out of all of these rows. You're going to make a Tunisian simple stitch in all of the stitches of the row. The only stitch that's a little bit different is the stitch above the puff stitch. And that's because you don't cast on into the puff stitch itself, but you cast on into the stitch above it. So I'll show you here in a minute. So skip your first vertical stitch, and you're going to Tunisian simple stitch in the second stitch, third, fourth, and fifth. And then you're going to get to your puff stitch. You're going to cast on 1 stitch using this top stitch above the puff. So right in here, you're going to insert your hook. You're going to yarn over and cast on 1. You're going to repeat this in the next puff stitch. So right above the puff stitch, you're going to find this little stitch right here. Insert your hook into it, yarn over, and cast on 1. Then you're going to cast on 1 stitch into each of the next 5 vertical stitches, so Tunisian simple stitch in the next 5 stitches, and you're going to get to the puff stitch. So cast on 1 into the stitch above the puff stitch. You're going to go to the next puff stitch and repeat. So cast on 1. So right up here, yarn over and pull up a loop. You're going to Tunisian simple stitch in the next 5 vertical stitches. Got 4 and then 5. And you're going to cast on 1 using the stitch above each of the next 2 puff stitches. You're going to finish the row by casting on 4 Tunisian simple stitches, and then you're going to cast on 1 in the final stitch of the row. So insert your hook into this final stitch right in here. Don't use this top chain stitch, use the one here on the side. So insert your hook into that last stitch or into the final stitch of the row, yarn over and cast on 1. And that was row number 2. The return pass for row number 2 is just a regular return pass. So yarn over, pull through 1, and for the rest of the row, you're going to yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. And if you need the written instructions for this pattern, check out the link in the description box below. It'll link you to the blog pattern as well as the PDF version of this pattern. Alright, so now why is row number 2 a little bit different than the first row? That's because the puff stitch is taller than a Tunisian simple stitch. Making a blanket or a scarf or anything that you want a straight edge like this one, you have to insert that additional row just to even out the stitching. So the puff stitch, as you can see here, is about the size of 2 rows, so you have to make up for it by using that second row. So if you watch the video tutorial where I showed you how to make the braided puff stitch, we only did rows of braided puff stitch, and that creates a really nice stitch, but as you can see, the stitches are a little bit higher, so you end up with a bit of a wavy project. So it just depends on what kind of edge you want for your project. So for an even edge, you have to insert that second row that we just did. So it's the one with just the simple Tunisian stitch all the way across. So something to notice on this pattern is that I don't give you row counts. So you'll see the stitch counts, so your chain 26, but you are not going to see any row counts because that depends on the yarn you are using. So you're going to make a length of 26 inches, but the rows really depend on what size of yarn you use. So if you're using this fingering yarn, a DK or a sport, it's going to be a little bit different than if you use a worsted yarn. Here's my sample of the worsted yarn. Now, if I put them side by side, you're going to notice that you require less rows in the worsted yarn to create a longer length. So to make the 26 inches, you would have a completely different stitch count, or row count, sorry, than you would if you use a fingering, DK, or sport yarn. So just make sure that you crochet 26 inches worth of rows. All right, so let's start row number 3 together. Now row number 3 is basically a repetition of row number 1. There is a little bit of a difference though, because now you have this additional row right here that you did not have when we created row 1. You are still going to create the puff stitch in the same way that we did in row 1. So we'll start here at the beginning of the row, and you have to cast on your 4 Tunisian simple stitches. So there's 2, 3, and then 4. And when you get to the puff stitch, so let me place my stitch marker here. When you get to the puff stitch, you're just going to skip the stitches here at the top of the row. You're still going to look for the chain space between the 2 puff stitches. And this top row isn't going to matter. You're just going to skip those. So look for the chain space right down here. So between the 2 puff stitches, there it is. And that is where you're going to cast on your puff stitch. So let's separate this here. And we're going to do the first puff stitch. So yarn over, and we're going to insert a hook into the chain space between the 2 puff stitches. So there's 1, and then we're going to do it again for 2, and then 3. So we've cast on our 6 loops. We're going to place a stitch marker, and then we're going to make our second puff stitch. So yarn over and cast on again. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So that's the only difference between row 1 and row 3. So you're going to do a repetition of row 1, just remember to use the puff stitch, not the stitch above, and do this in all of the puff stitches. And now to complete the length of your scarf, you're going to repeat row 1 and row 2, or row 3 if you want to look at it that way, until you've completed a length of about 26 inches. While I continue working on this row, for those of you that don't want to make the short scarf, but would rather use this stitch to make just a regular long scarf, just continue repeating rows 1 and 2 until you make the length of scarf that you want. So try it on as you crochet it so you know how long your scarf is, because there isn't just one general size of scarves. I get that question a lot. So for the scarf length, it really is just a personal preference. So just keep crocheting, try it on, and there you go. Let's go back to our pattern here. Now as you can see, I'm back at the puff stitch. Once I'm here at the puff stitch, I'm going to look for that chain space, ignore these top stitches right here, and I'm going to cast on my first puff stitch in that chain space that's in between the 2 puff stitches of the row before, so of the previous row. So there we go, I've got my first puff stitch. I'm going to place a stitch marker, and then I'm going to make my second puff stitch. And here's 3. All right, so there you go. We're going to do the rest of the row. So you do your Tunisian simple stitch, so you're going to do your 5, and then your puff stitch, and then your 4 at the end, and then cast on your final row, and then just repeat your return pass like we did for the previous repetitions of row 1. Something to note while you're working on your scarf length is that you need to pay attention to some of these hidden stitches. For instance, this little hidden vertical stitch is not part of our stitch count, so it's one of the vertical stitches that was in that top row that we skipped. So you need to count your stitches as you cast them on, because remember here at the end of the row we only cast on 4 Tunisian simple stitch and then the final stitch of the row. So make sure that you maintain your stitch count, because otherwise you'll end up with a wider scarf. So it'll start narrow and end up wide, and you'll end up with a bit of a triangular looking scarf. And that's fine if you're trying to make a triangular shawl, but right now we're just trying to make an even size scarf. So stitch counts, they're very important. Make sure that you count them as you are casting on your Tunisian simple stitches. So that's a quick note there. I'm going to continue working on another row, and then I'll show you how to do the bind off so that we can finish up the scarf. So I finished my row 1 repeat, and when you finish your length of 26 inches, you want to end on a row 1 repeat so that you have your puff stitch and then the little stitch like this on top. We're now going to work a bind off row, and the reason you need a bind off is because we need to close up this spacing right there between the stitches so that we create a nice even edge, because this is the part that's going to be visible on our scarf. So we want this edge to be nice and crisp and very pretty. So in order to create this edge, let's start working on the bind off. So for the bind off, we're going to cast on similarly to what we did for row number 2, but we're going to end in a single crochet. So casting on into that second vertical stitch, we're going to work a Tunisian simple stitch. So just insert your hook through that top loop, yarn over, and pull up a loop. Once you have 2 loops on your hook, you're going to close this as a single crochet. So you're going to yarn over and pull this top loop through the 2 loops on your hook for a single crochet. So now you only have 1 loop on your hook. You're going to repeat this in all of the stitches along the top of the row. So Tunisian simple stitch, you'll have 2 loops, and then yarn over and pull through 2. So Tunisian simple stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then yarn over, pull through 2. When you get to the puff stitch, you're going to cast it on like you did for row 2. So you're going to use this top stitch right up here. You're going to insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and once you have 2 loops on your hook, you're just going to single crochet. So yarn over and pull through 2. And that's it. You're going to repeat this in the next puff stitch. And there you go. So just repeat this stitching until you get to the end of the row. In the final stitch, you're going to cast it on just like you normally would for any of these other rows. So insert your hook into the stitch. So we're going to go through both loops here, and then yarn over, pull up a loop. Once you have both loops on your hook, you're going to single crochet. And then I like to finish on a chain 1 because that makes a knot at the end. So let me show you here on our scarf sample. So here we go. So let's say we're here at that last stitch. I chain 1 to make a little knot here at the end, and then I pull my yarn through. So I pull up on my hook, pull up on my yarn, and then just pull it out. So make sure you cut a really long thread because you're going to use this thread to sew the scarf together here in a minute. So once you finish this whole section of the scarf, go through and weave in any tail ends like this one here. I had a bit of a knot on my yarn, so I had to cut everything and start over. So weave in these ends, and then the ends here at the beginning of the row. If you don't know how to weave in ends, look for the link for a video tutorial. It's going to be in the description box, and I show you how to do this step by step. So now you've got your bind off, you're ready to sew. Now before I sew this scarf together, let's talk about the multiples because it's a little bit easier to see when the scarf is laying flat like this. Now the multiples for this pattern is 7 plus 5. So the Tunisian stitching plus the puff stitch is 7. So right here we have 7 stitches. And then if we go into the next section, we have 7 stitches. So it's 5 Tunisian simple stitch and then 2 with a puff, 5 with the Tunisian stitch, 2 with the puff. And then at the end of the row, we have to add 5. So your multiples are 7 plus 5. So for each of your multiples of 7, you would just look at your puff stitch. So however many columns of puff stitch you want, that's however many times you multiply by 7. So for this scarf, we have 3. So it's 3 times 7 plus 5. If you're trying to figure out how big to make a blanket, you can just take the measurements that we used here for the scarf. So this scarf using this yarn is, like we said, about 5 inches across, and I used 3 multiples of 7. So decide how wide you want your blanket to be and then multiply however many multiples of 7 you would need to reach that length. But that's it. That's all the information I have about the multiples. If you still have any questions about that, just leave it down in the comment section below. So I'm going to be sewing the scarf using the long tail end that we left attached to the scarf a little earlier ago. I don't need that long of a thread, so I'm just going to cut about here, because if your thread is too long, it's going to get knotted up as you sew. So I'm just going to cut right around here. I'm going to grab my yarn needle. We're going to thread both threads of yarn through. There we go. And we're ready to sew. So line up your scarf. So you're going to lay it flat on the table in front of you or wherever you're working. And you're going to lay it face down and horizontal to you. So you're looking at the back side of the stitching. Fold the 2 narrow ends like this towards the front. So you should now be looking at your Tunisian stitching. And you're going to get the side with the initial chain. So right at here. So it's a little bit the wavy or the curly side. You're going to line it up along the inside of the scarf. So along one of the longer ends. So make sure that you match up your 2 corners. And we're going to begin stitching here on the wavy side of our scarf. So we're going to stitch through here. And the way I like to stitch, I mean, really you can use whatever stitch you want, but I'm going to be stitching on one side and then I go and stitch on the opposite side. So I don't stitch on them together. So look for your stitches like this. So I'm going to insert my needle into this bottom corner stitch, and I'm going to pull it up in the stitch right next to it, like this. And then I'm just going to pull through. And I'm going to repeat this on the right side. So I'm going to insert my needle right here in this next stitch, pull it up in the stitch right next to it so that I have the stitch on the hook like this. Not on the hook, on the needle. I spend so much time crocheting, I say hook for everything. All right, we're going to pull through. We're going to insert the needle in the stitch. As you can see here, the yarn's coming out. So that is where I want to insert my needle. So it's the stitch where your previous stitch was, if that makes any sense. So we're going to pull through. Here, I'll show it to you again on this other side. So you see where the yarn comes out right here from the previous stitch? So there's our previous stitch. This is the stitch you want to insert your needle into, and then up on into the next stitch, so the one right after that. And then pull through. So I will stitch a few of these stitches, and then I'll line up my work, just kind of lay it flat on the table, and then pull on your thread a little bit to tighten it up. Don't tighten it up too much, because then it'll scrunch up your work. Just lightly pull through until you get the look that you want. And then go through, stitch a few more stitches, I don't know, do like 6 to 8, and then you pull on that thread a little bit. So tighten it up slowly as you go. That way you keep the tension even, and you end up with a really nice and clean seam. So go through, stitch along the edge of the scarf, make a knot, and then weave in your ends. And I'll show you what the scarf is going to look like here once you finish sewing in just a minute. So here we go. I've finished stitching my scarf. This is what the seam looks like. I added a little label here at the end. That's totally optional, but there we go. So here's the seam, and that's it. So for those of you that wonder what this stitch looks like on the back side, here's a view of the back side of the scarf. So you can look at it this way, or you can turn it this other way. So as you can see, this is not exactly a reversible stitch, but it is still a really nice stitch if you choose to use it for a flat scarf or a blanket. But there you go. So just a quick note for everybody, I do plan on making the matching hat for this pattern, but I'm not going to post a tutorial next week. So the first week of November, there will be no tutorial. I have my dad's birthday gift I really need to finish, and I just haven't had any time to work on it. So there won't be a tutorial next week, but in the second week of November, I will post the matching hat pattern for this scarf. So be on the lookout for that. The pattern will also be available on the shop, and you'll be able to purchase it as a bundle. But that's it. So that was our tutorial for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button. And if you want to see more of my projects, you can follow me on Instagram or visit my website. On the website, you'll find the patterns for all of the projects that we've done here on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all again in the next tutorial.